When black kids get high at carnival, it's a national scandal. When white kids pop pills at Glastonbury, it's just good fun. But when Boris Johnson and Michael Gove admit to snorting cocaine, that's when it gets interesting. Then the ruling class have no choice but to countenance drug decriminalisation or else have a criminal in number 10. So is it time to demand cocaine for the masses, not just for the ruling classes? And are we on the brink of an end to the war on drugs? To answer both questions, I'm delighted to be joined by Kojo Koram, lecturer in law at Birkbeck and editor of The War on Drugs, The Global Colour Line.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
To the show. Also joined by Tanzil Chowdhury, who's lecturer in law at Queen Mary and a contributor to that volume.
Thank you very much for having us, Michael.
How are you both doing?
Doing okay.
Took you a while to get here. I know we haven't quite got the central London studio yet, but we're getting there, you know?
Yeah, it took a little bit of time, but we made it. Wouldn't miss out.
So we're going to start with what everyone's been talking about the last 2 months, is the drug habits of Tory politicians. So we've got Michael Gove had a coke habit at the Times, Jeremy Hunt, cannabis lassie in India, kind of tame, Rory Stewart, opium at an Iranian wedding. Very retro. And Johnson snorted cocaine at Univeristy, though he told Have I Got News for You, I sneezed and it did not go up my nose. I don't know whether to believe that or not. But the question, should we be making a bigger deal of the fact that the next Prime Minister will have taken illegal drugs?
I mean, first of all, I think that this plethora of Tory politicians confessing to drug use is probably the most effective anti-drug campaign that's been run in the last 20, 30 years, because they've finally managed to make cocaine and cannabis uncool. And I think it is something that people should care about, because it does speak to the double standards in terms of the consequences of experimental drug use. You know, the ability for not just the higher echelons of the Tory party, but elite members of the major universities, of the major boarding schools, to indulge in drug experimentation has been a long established tradition. And I think that it is a real kind of contradiction to see them be able to explore with that and then go on to such successful careers, when other people who might engage in these substances end up being drawn into the criminal justice system and having life-altering consequences. I think that this isn't a new contradiction. The next British Prime Minister, who will most likely be someone who's admitted to certain levels of drug use, isn't going to be the first head of state who's admitted drug use and then gone on to implement quite prohibitionist
in this country, who else
policies.
did we have that was...
David Cameron admitted to...
Oh, was he a coke fiend as well at university?
Not the coke fiend, but he admitted to cannabis use.
Okay.
In the United States, Barack Obama, obviously the Bill Clinton didn't inhale story.
Yeah.
So, there's been a long list of heads of state globally who have admitted to experimental drug use in their own youth and then gone to implement prohibitionist drug policies that have really had a detrimental impact on those who aren't as privileged as them.
Tanzil?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't add too much to what Kojo said, other than I think once we recognise a lot of the hypocrisies and contradictions in, future leaders of the state, heads of government, consuming drugs, it opens up the questions about how we perceive drug consumption among different categories of people and how they're classed and how they're raced. Drug consumption among particular classed and raced populations and individuals tends to be seen as something quite harmless. Sometimes there's a kind of an indulgence and a fascination with it, and that's actually got quite an interesting genealogy with this kind of voyeuristic fascination with people from the kind of aristocratic classes indulging in opium, and we see that within the kind of English cultural memory, and those that are consuming drugs from communities of colour, working class communities, and that this is seen as kind of a civilizational crisis, a social malaise. So the contradiction is important because it opens up to bigger class and race contradictions, I think.
I remember when Michael Gove was on Andrew Marr, he said, Andrew Marr asked him, could you have gone to prison? And Michael Gove said, yes, I was lucky I didn't go to prison. But at the same time, I mean, whatever race or class you are, not many people go to jail for taking drugs today. It's nearly always for supplying or something. Is that correct?
Yeah, in terms of actual facing incarceration, at least in the United Kingdom, in places like the United States, there are still people who end up in prison due to drug possession. And there's also the possibility of drug possession being an acceleratory element of other crimes. And so that might lead to an incarceration sentence. But for drug possession on its own, very few people do end up currently facing prison time. But in terms of the consequences for your life, that's not the only punitive consequences that could happen. I mean, Michael Gove, when he was Education Secretary, oversaw lifetime bans for teachers who were convicted of drug possession, including those multiple teachers who had cocaine possession convictions and ended up losing their jobs as it escalated.
So that actually happened.
There.
So
So
I never found them. They should have interviewed some of these
I mean, I
cocaine
just think,
teachers because it would have been a good
could
bit
you
of content.
imagine being one of those teachers
Yeah.
sitting at home, having lost your job, maybe still looking for work, having to try and make ends meet, and then watching on TV the Education Secretary oversaw this particular policy, not only admitting to use of that same substance, but then saying, oh, it was youthful indiscretion, can't we just let bygones be bygones? So I think that that's a real stark example of the way in which power and privilege can shield people of the consequences of contravening drug laws.
I mean, I know from both your work that when we talk about how to resolve this hypocrisy, it's not going to be by being harsher on aristocrats taking cocaine. It's going to be on some sort of legal reform. But before we get there, I want to go through some of the elements of the book you've just edited.
Yeah.
There's lots of content in there that I'm sure our audience will be very interested in. I want to start with, a basic question. It's always good to ask a question about the title, which doesn't mean I haven't read the book. I have. But, it's a striking title, right? Yeah. So, The War on Drugs and the Global Colour Line. Most of our audience will know what the war on drugs is. What is the global colour line?
So when we talk about the global colour line, the reference to the global colour line is drawn from African-American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, who at the turn of the 20th century said that the problem of the 20th century would be resolving the global colour line, the formal and often legal separation of people according to the race that had been drawn across the world during the period of European colonialism. And so that's, and that you can see not only in terms of the globe as a whole, but also within states themselves, South Africa, the United States of America, where Du Bois was from, formal segregation. And over the course of the 20th century, that formal segregation, that formal drawing of the global colour line appeared to have been overcome. You got the victories in terms of civil rights, decolonization, victory over apartheid, but when we look at a lot of other material elements of life, we still see that stark division between people of different races, and the war on drugs is one of the preeminent examples of that, in terms of who is being arrested, who is being charged if they're being arrested, who is facing prison time, who is being stopped and searched, whose homes are being destroyed in aerial fumigation policies. We think about, the agricultural regions in the global south that face the consequences of drug prohibition. We think about, which areas are facing the explosions of violence, the result from the attempt of kind of draconian militarized prohibition. We're seeing a clear division across the world and within states between different racial groups as to who is suffering as a result of the war on drugs. And so that's what we're referring to when we talk about the global colour line, that if you actually have a look at not only who's taking drugs, but who is suffering the consequences of the attempts to try and ban drugs from the world, which is what the international treaties on drug prohibition are looking to do, to try and ban the illegitimate use of drugs, then we can see a division amongst different racial groups across the world, and that's what we're referring to.
And Tanzil, in your piece in the volume, you apply this idea to festivals in the UK. So an example very close to home, you've got Secret Garden Party and Notting Hill Carnival. You give us the history of those two festivals and talk about the different ways that they are policed vis-a-vis drugs. So can you talk about what you found out?
Yeah, I mean, the global colour line is, I think, an important and illuminating tool to understand the kind of antinomous drug policing strategies. And, prior to the beginning of the end of formal colonisation within the European context, you could roughly draw the global colour line along maybe kind of boundaries and nation-state countries. But that global colour line can exist within nation-states between a government and diaspora populations. And we can see this manifested, for example, through music festivals. So part of the research that I did was to compare the antinomous drug policing strategies at Secret Garden Party and Notting Hill Carnival. So Notting Hill Carnival obviously has got a really important, interesting, nourishing history, and in terms of its kind of entanglement with imperialism, but also kind of the repressive British state. So it has its original origins in the former British colony of Trinidad, taken upon by the recently freed, enslaved black people, and that's where it begins to invite the ire of the colonial state, and then when it comes over to the UK in the 50s and 60s, the British state. And there's always been that antagonism between the police, the Metropolitan Police, and Notting Hill Carnival, and this reached its kind of apotheosis in, I think, the mid-70s. 1975, you have, I think, 60 police officers there, and then the following year you have 1,200 police officers, and that marks a critical juncture in the way in which that festival is policed. And one of the things I think that are characteristic of policing of the Notting Hill Carnival is what I call kind of racialized drug policing, and this is characterized by three things. One is preemptive policing, two is high raw numbers of drug-related arrests, and the third is saturated police presence, and then also accompanying that are various kind of facial recognition technologies, but I don't kind of go into that. So the first part of it, the first character and feature of drug policing strategies in Notting Hill Carnival was the preemptive policing. So if we look at what happened in 2017, the Metropolitan Police tweeted about a raid on a heroin stash, and they posted it and showed it off to the world, and they said, we're doing our job, we're trying to make Notting Hill Carnival safe and free of illegal substances. The only problem was that drug raid took place in Catford, which I think is about 10 miles away from Notting Hill Carnival, and Stormzy actually pulled up the Metropolitan Police about it.
And it was heroin, right, as well, wasn't it?
It was heroin.
Like, who takes heroin at Carnival?
I'm not too sure, but I mean, therein lies, I think, the misunderstandings of the way that the police understands the issue. The other thing was the kind of raw number of drug-related arrests. So in 2017, you had 169 arrests that were made at Notting Hill Carnival, and in terms of the raw numbers, that's comparatively higher to most of the other festivals. But if you were to scale up the number of attendees at the other festivals, so you've got about 1.5 million people overall that attend the Notting Hill Carnival, you compare that to somewhere like Creamfields, which had 130 drug-related arrests, but only 70,000 people attend. That would be the equivalent on the Notting Hill attendees scale of around about just under 3,000 drug-related arrests. And you can compare this to Latitude Festival, which I think received the award for the most family-friendly festival. But if you scale up the number of drug-related arrests, it far exceeds Notting Hill Carnival. And yet, Notting Hill Carnival receives the saturated media coverage that it's this hotbed of drug dealers, etc., etc. And then the other feature of that is obviously kind of this saturated police presence, which has been symptomatic of policing the Notting Hill Carnival. Now, you can compare that to the Secret Garden Party. The Secret Garden Party it's fairly uncontroversial to say it's kind of been racialised and classed as a kind of white middle class festival, and not to in any way demean those that go to the festival or say that it's not interesting and exciting.
We're not getting any guest tickets now.
No, right, yeah, exactly. Well, thankfully, unfortunately, it's finished, but I certainly would have gotten it.
Little slip there.
This is a festival that began in someone's backyard, which was actually the land of a baron. And in its final festival, I think it had around about like...
started by an Eton educated kid, wasn't it?
That's correct, yeah. And there was about 30,000 people that went to the last 2017 festival. And Secret Garden Party was kind of seen as a progenitor of boutique music festivals, to kind of within this kind of larger glamping a market of festivals. And, you know, it kind of pulled from this kind of very kind of bohemian hipster aesthetic, and the way that the popular press referred to it as was making music festivals palatable for posh people. Now, the drug policing strategy there was starkly different to the ones that they deployed at the Notting Hill Carnival. And what they used was what was known as a multi-agency safety testing system. And what this was in a nutshell was allowing attendees of the festival to basically get their drugs checked for purity, on the presumption that people are going to take drugs at festivals, so it's better that they're taking good quality stuff rather than crap. Now, the problem with that is not that a harm reduction method is used. If anything, that ought to be lauded, given the reality that people are going to take drugs, especially at a music festival. The problem is obviously the stark contrast in the ways in which that's deployed at a festival which is racing class in one particular way, in stark contrast to the way that drug policing strategies are deployed at Nottingham Carnival. And this is fundamentally a question, I think, about the way in which we perceive drug consumption among communities of colour and drug consumption among communities which are racialised as white. The former sees drug consumption as a matter that needs to be dealt with by the criminal justice system, and the latter sees drug consumption by people racialised as white from middle and upper class communities as one which is either invites fascination and curiosity, or one which ought to be dealt with by kind of public health harm reduction methods. And that's fundamentally the difference, and where those differences, I think, emerge from.
And I think that this notion of the global colour line within the universal structure of drug prohibition is really crucial to try and understand how the system has managed to sustain itself over the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. I think one thing that's always worthwhile noticing is how recent this system of international drug prohibition actually is. We have the very first international laws against drug prohibition, starting with the 1909 Shanghai Opium Commission. So, we're a little over 100 years old. Prior to that, across the 18th and 17th century, drugs that are now completely seen as deviant, drugs like opium, drugs like cocaine, were being traded by the European empires alongside coffee and sugar and other psychoactive substances. Britain famously fought a war with China to make sure that it can maintain control of the opium trade, so central was it to its interests in the East Indies. And so it's only with the kind of the transition to the 20th century that we really get the system of international drug prohibition. And it has been, on an empirical level, quite a spectacular failure. There's over $300 billion, the United Nations estimate, per annum that is spent on trying to enforce the international drug treaties, whilst at the same time statistics in terms of recreational use, statistics in terms of the trade, continue to go up and up and up each year. It was in 1998 the United Nations held a conference under the title of A Drug-Free World, We Could Do It.
Wow.
We could talk about how successful that has been.
When was that, sorry?
1998.
1998, they still thought we could have a drug-free world.
Still thought a drug-free world, so that was the title of this particular conference. But I think if we look at it on an empirical level, we would say, why do we continue to persist with this policy that causes such devastation, that costs so much money, that is so clearly ineffective in terms of reducing people's drug use, in terms of reducing drug trade? I don't think you can really explain that without an understanding of the division in terms of who is actually being impacted by these laws, which communities, which countries, which people are facing the consequences. And once you understand that, you can understand how it starts to sustain itself. If Secret Garden Party was policed in the same way that Notting Hill Carnival was, it would probably take about 2 years before drug policy reform was on the manifesto of, the Tory party at the next election.
There's a couple, in terms of sort of like causal explanations, there's a couple of ways that I wasn't sure sort of like how you were using the global colour line. So one is the idea that the way that drug laws have been enacted has an unequal effect on people of different ethnic backgrounds or people from different parts of the world. And because most of the negative effects are concentrated on black people or non-white people, that means that an unsuccessful war, or at least a war that has huge human cost, is allowed to continue. The other sort of almost stronger claim is that one of the reasons we have a war on drugs is precisely to subjugate black people. So I know that one reason, probably in terms of that second theory, that's most popularized in the idea that, which to be honest, I haven't read enough about it, so I don't know if it's true, but the FBI flooded black communities with crack in the 1970s to try and undermine black radicalism. I don't know if you can speak to which one of those two options it is.
So in terms of the argument that we made within the book, I wouldn't say that we so explicitly lent on the idea that this was, as a kind of conspiratorially constructed in order to devastate communities of colour around the world. There is a lot of evidence that gives a bit of illumination to that. probably most famously people might know is the recording of one of Richard Nixon's chiefs of staff, who talks about how we couldn't make illegal being black, we couldn't make illegal being against the war, but we could make illegal marijuana consumption because of its relationship to those particular communities. That gave us a reason to police them. But I don't think that it is as kind of conscious as that. I think that if you look at the emergence of drug prohibition, and it really does emerge in the United States of America, in the turn of the 20th century, with a real rise of kind of anti-vice organization, concern with a kind of Christian moralism starting to filter into public policy and then international policy. What you get is the fear of proximity between idealized racial classes that United States would consider white, and deviant racial classes in terms of the way opium was associated with Chinese communities and for immigrant workers that were constructing the Californian rail system, in terms of the way that cocaine was associated with African American populations. And you start to get, almost hilarious newspaper headlines about the superhuman impact the cocaine has upon African Americans. You get reports such as one of the first drug warriors, Hamilton Wright, going to the United Nations Congress and reading out the reason why we need to prohibit cocaine is because of the devastating impact that it has on our young white teenagers, who can, have one taste of the drug and next thing they're in an opium den, being defiled by these dangerous men from the East. There is a fear of the ability for certain substances to facilitate racial transgression that I think informs the construction of these particular laws, and that unsurprisingly therefore leads to the actual implementation and the enforcement of those laws being felt hardest on those communities that are seen as racially deviant. I don't think it's necessarily a conscious manipulation, but I think if you actually read the writings of people like Bishop Brent, Hamilton Wright, of course Harry Anslinger, all of the early drug warriors that really pushed international drug prohibition into the legislative arena, you can see their fears and anxieties about race very close to the surface.
So that's kind of somewhere in between the two options I said, right? So it's not so much that the racial impact is accidental and allowed it to continue because it was unequal racially, or that these laws were created specifically to subjugate black and brown people, but the reason these laws were created was because people associated these substances with black and brown people, which was precisely why they thought they were bad substances that needed banning.
I think definitely, but even further than that, I would say not just associated these substances with black and brown people, but feared the ability for these substances to turn even idealized white individuals into the kind of savage, lazy, violent, uncontrollable image that was associated with black and brown people. And so I think that if it was just a fear about how these drugs were used within these communities of color, it wouldn't have been such a moral panic. I think that the real crux of the moral panic came with the fear of the ability for these substances to turn, even the most kind of barbarian, Protestant, work ethic, endeavorous and self-sacrificing, the idealized Calvinist capitalist subject can be turned into, the reefer madness style, violent, debauched individual that we associated with racial subaltern subjects.
I think let's go on to some proposals. I mean, we've got a lot of reasons there that we want to reform these drug laws. First of all, you're watching Novara Media, you're watching Tiski Sour. As you know, this is only possible because of your kind support. So if you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Please like this video on YouTube. Please share it on Twitter, share it on Facebook. We want more people to see it. Keep your comments coming. Of course, I will be putting your questions to our guests at the end of the show. Proposals. What do we want? If you were, I suppose, advising the next government, how do you think we should change Britain's drugs laws?
Shall I start with you? Shall I start with? Okay. Well, first of all, I think the main thing to really emphasize is that reform is inevitable. That's the first thing that I would say. So the world's already changing in terms of the drug laws. Since 2012, we've seen multiple nation states around the world transition into legal recreational marijuana markets. So Canada, Uruguay, New Zealand's got a referendum coming up in 2020. We've seen a plethora of states within the United States of America implement legal cannabis markets. So we've got Colorado, California, Ohio, Alaska even. So so in terms of the world is changing, that's the first thing that I would make clear. And then I would think about not merely having a crude distinction between full legalization. So next thing you know, heroin's being sold, in Tesco next to, Kit Kats, or the kind of prohibitionist system that we might have had, since the kind of middle of the 20th century. But talk about different policies that could be implemented for different substances. And crucially, I think, thinking about how to repair the harm that has been suffered disproportionately by particular communities over the period of drug prohibition. So I don't think there can be any transition out of the war on drugs without trying to fix the harm of the war on drugs. And so when we're talking about concrete policies, I'm talking about commuting of sentences, such as happened in Illinois, being discussed in Illinois. There's no point.
What is that after they legalize? Have they legalized cannabis?
So yeah, in terms of legalizing cannabis, but in alignment with legalizing cannabis, ensuring that it doesn't make any sense if you're gonna have a system in which it's legal and in fact very profitable for a lot of these hedge funds to start trading cannabis and marijuana dispensaries, to have still people sitting in prison for crimes of trading marijuana. That's a clear contradiction. And in fact, in a lot of places, the only people who aren't able to actually open up these dispensaries are people who have criminal convictions. So I think that they've got the expertise.
The only people that can't legally sell weed are people who sold weed before it was legalized.
Exactly, and they're that's just a waste of expertise. On a basic capitalist level. Doesn't make sense to me. But so I talk about policies in terms of the commuting of sentences, in terms of investment in disenfranchised and impoverished communities in order to allow them to enter what is now becoming a kind of exciting new market for global capital. Training for how to navigate the bureaucracy. A plethora of different harm reduction policies for substances that may not be able to enter the legal market. So thinking about needle exchanges in terms of heroin use, thinking about social reintegration. Policies for those people who have suffered long-term addiction. There's no point trying to say to somebody, just get off this particular substance. You need to think about what's their housing situation, what's their employment situation, are they suffering with debt? These are the kind of social integrations that you need to use to try and address these issues. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001, and these are the type of additional policies that they brought into place in order to reduce what was once the highest HIV rate in all of Europe, and the criminal justice rate. All of those have gone into decline, and so these are the sort of policies that I'd be willing to talk to whoever in the UK government was willing to listen to.
So you mentioned Portugal. Portugal decriminalized drugs, right?
Yeah.
So they haven't legalized them, and these United States states, so Oregon, Illinois, Alaska, etc., they've legalized weed, so now corporations can sell weed, but they haven't decriminalized anything else.
No.
So can we talk about the difference between decriminalization and legalization? And what are your positions on them, I suppose, as well?
Should I jump in?
Yeah.
So in crude, when we're talking about decriminalization, we're talking about taking something from being a criminal offence into being a civil offence. And so no longer is it going to be dealt with in terms of the kind of criminal arena of law, but we're thinking about something that's being dealt with closer to, say, a parking ticket or a traffic fine. That's what we'd be more familiar with. In Portugal, the result of someone being caught with possession of drugs would lead to them being in front of, to get a citation and then be in front of drug courts. Drug courts will be made up by an attorney, a social worker, and a psychiatrist, and as a result of that, they would then think about what's the best policy for this person to try and help them if they have problematic substance use. So that's very different from what's happening in terms of marijuana reform around the world, when it is becoming now a legally tradable commodity in which people open up dispensaries. There's huge amounts of investment in terms of hedge funds. There are huge potential opportunities for wealth. It's becoming a real emerging market. in a capitalist world that is, in a moment of quite acute crisis and looking for new areas of potential profit accumulation. Marijuana has become that, and depending on how legalization is implemented, there can be a real danger of it becoming a free-for-all for the international capitalist class, and that's why it's so popular with your Evening Standard or the Adam Smith Institutes or some members of the Tory party.
Let's do legalization and the dangers of in a second. I want to talk a bit more about decriminalization, because it sounds, on the one hand, kind of intuitive and uncontroversial. Obviously when someone takes a drug, it seems nonsensical to throw them into prison, and we should offer them help instead of a sort of punitive response when it only affected themselves. On the other hand, it strikes me a bit duplicitous and also a bit, like wet. It's sort of saying, there's nothing wrong with taking it, but there's something very wrong with selling it. And it's like, if we want to take pills, someone's going to have to sell them. So I feel almost, like for moral purposes, I should face the same consequences as the person that sold it to me. And it also treats drugs as a vice, when I think what the sort of Tory party race and a lot of what we were talking about earlier or shows or suggests is that most people making these laws, in their heart of hearts, is like, actually cocaine's quite fun, actually ecstasy's quite fun, and they have to put on this show of treating it as a vice. And decriminalization, for me, even though it gets rid of some of the most appalling effects, let's say, of the war of drugs domestically, it doesn't deal with any of those issues.
No, absolutely. I would say not only in terms of who's supplying the drugs, but also in terms of who's producing the drugs. Where are these drugs being produced? Decriminalization doesn't, unfortunately, address that. If you have the idea that there can never be socialism in one country, maybe there can never be, drug reform in one country. We need to think about this at a global scale. International drug laws have had what kind of drug policy experts describe as a supply side heavy orientation, in terms of the weight of prohibition has been visited upon the places and areas and where it's been produced. Obviously there was huge...
Easier to bomb foreign people, isn't it?
There's been huge devastation all around the world in terms of drug prohibition, but in terms of, the impact on Cali, Colombia, in terms of the impact on Juarez, Mexico, in terms of the impact in Afghanistan, these are the areas that have really suffered through the attempt to try and police the illegitimate trade of substances that are prohibited by international law. Drug decriminalization doesn't immediately address those issues, so I think we need to be, looking at it on that global scale. That's what we try and do in the book that we wrote, is to try and look at this problem at the global scale and to think about how can we reform the use of these substances, because they are being used and they are going to be used in the future. How can we reform the laws around the use of these substances so that it doesn't lead to, Amerindian communities being displaced from their land, or having their entire, year of, crops being destroyed by aerial fumigation because they were next to a farm that, the kind of counter narcotics police thought was a cocaine producing farm. So just the whole area gets sprayed with
the images of the spraying is quite incredible. It looks like Vietnam with napalm or something, because they're just going over the rainforests, spraying indiscriminately, quite toxic.
That's it.
Well, I suppose the material or the chemical is designed to kill any organic matter, right?
Absolutely.
So that's obviously what's going to happen.
One of the things that I'd kind of want to add in terms of how decriminalisation maybe doesn't affect or impact upon the kind of global war on drugs, I think requires us to kind of start from ground zero. And this may be kind of a fairly obvious thing to many of the viewers and us sitting around the table, but what actually is a drug? And there's a famous quote by Derrida where he says there is no such thing as drugs in nature, or words to that effect. Drugs don't refer to a natural scientific category. They're an entirely contingent concept. And once we kind of accept that the emergence of the word drug comes out of a particular point in history, then we begin to understand the way in which drugs as a signifier has been used as a way to police communities and countries of colour. And this is fundamentally what we understand by the global colour line, but also the ways in which in the post-colonial world the the government has been able to police diaspora communities. And I think understanding what we mean by drugs and that kind of genealogy, and there's many people who've written on this, and I think the article that I always find really nice to return to is by Toby Seddon, not necessarily because he said anything new, but he synthesised a lot of this nature. But the idea that drug is an entirely contingent concept, and it's often deployed at particular moments to police communities, either within the imperial metropole or more globally. And the one example that kind of occurs in my mind was the criminalisation of cat, which is a chewable stimulant, popular, I think, primarily within the Somali, maybe the Ethiopian community, but mainly
around the Horn of Africa,
yeah,
and like the Arabian Peninsula, yeah.
And you know, I mean, I lived in Manchester for 10 years, and the Home Office criminalised cat. There was no kind of moral panic that presaged this criminalisation, but it seemed as if it was used as a pretext, certainly within Greater Manchester, to raid Somali cafes, which were quite numerous in particular parts of Moss Side. So when we think about the proposals for reform, and I don't want to be one of these people that kind of sits in this ivory tower and has this very kind of abstract conversation about what drugs are, but I think that can inform part of the ways in which we create these policies, because decriminalisation doesn't immediately affect or impact the ways in which these wider global social structures work. And so that as an in to understand the ways in which this global colour line is reinforced, not just along borders of nation states, but within nation states, I think is really important to kind of deconstruct and break down.
I mean, just jump on that. I think that the cat example is a really useful example to try and hold on to as an example of how prohibition functions. It's a very recent example because there was a little bit of a moral panic in terms of once the kind of figures of kind of domestic terrorism started being associated with communities from the Horn of Africa, from the Arabian Peninsula, then all of a sudden you started to see Daily Mail stories saying, these nice young Somali boys, they're being radicalized because they go to these cat chewing houses, they chew these substances, they end up drinking in all of this radical politics, and next thing you know, they're committing these atrocities. And so once you started to have the association of the substance with the community, with the threat to the society as a whole, then the substance became prohibited, when 99% of people probably had no idea what it was. And if they ever did have the chance to take it, would be like, this has less effect than my cup of coffee.
It depends what example you pick though, right? So I know you're coming from a place which I think has a lot to inform us, or where it's, I suppose it's kind of a post-structuralist critique where you look at where does this concept of drugs come from and say it's not an objective thing that exists in nature. But, and I mean, cat, the example of that, speaks to that. But you can also take the example of methadone. So say I went to university, fairly posh with a lot of white people, and for a year or two methadone was legal, people were just getting it delivered to their houses, everyone was taking methadone, and then 2 years down the line it gets banned. And this actually links to the legalization question, because at that point, I mean, I don't think they banned it for any global colour line reasons. I think they banned it because they thought, well, potentially there's some medical problems, but also this, I don't know, actually it's an interesting question why they banned methadone, because it's not a race class thing, I don't think particularly, but leading into the legalization question, when they did it, people were quite relieved, I have to say. People who were like, wow, our campuses were so, not the people who were taking it, the people who were taking it were like, man, that was way too easily accessible, I'm so glad it's become a bit more difficult.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the methadone example, for any of our audience who don't know what methadone is, it's a bit like MDMA, and for a while in, say, like the early 2010s, it was sold on the internet as plant food fertilizer, but if you snorted it, it gave you a high, a bit like MDMA, but for a quarter of the price. So I wonder how, one, the banning of that substance sort of fits into your narrative, and two, how the experience that I had a conversation with someone about drug legalization earlier in the week, and they brought up this as well, where they were like, actually, to be honest, when methadone got banned, I was relieved. So I wonder if we can speak to those two things.
Yeah. So I mean, first of all, I think that the idea, I don't want to be misunderstood when I talk about the way in which ideas around race and fears around racial transgression feed into the prohibition of substances. And I'm not saying that, well, if it's taken by people of colour, then it's going to be banned. I think drugs, and that's what happened with a lot of the kind of big three drugs that are prohibited in the United States, opium, cocaine, and cannabis. They didn't become prohibited at the turn of the 20th century just because they were being taken by communities of colour. They were primarily being prohibited because they were taken by white communities, and the fear that the impact of the substances upon white communities was making them into the kind of figures that we would associate with other races.
But was it also partly that they were just trying to protect them from vices?
But I guess, how do you determine what a vice is? A vice is not a kind of independent category. It's something that's constructed within the morality of that particular society. And if people consider
there are some
negative
objective
impact of that-
criteria though, aren't there? If it's highly addictive, if it leads to a breakdown of relationships you might be having, if it leads to psychotic problems.
But I think, I think the intervention you made there really leads on to the second part in terms of what about the dangers of legalization, and what is some of those issues? Is there an objective inherent danger within particular psychoactive substances that legalization of any form might open up? I think when we talk about addiction, when we talk about this idea of breakdown of social relations, I think that we do need to think about it again within particular social contexts. The idea of why we drawn to these particular substances, why we drawn to this desire for intoxication, can't be divorced from the alienation of capitalist society, from the kind of exhaustion and people feeling like an inability to create those kind of interpersonal bonds. There's a very different way that we have used substances traditionally in the West than often the way that they've been used in more ritualistic or in more quasi-religious elements, throughout global history. I think there's a real danger about the way the legalization might be implemented, where these substances might be used in terms of a kind of a free-for-all and facilitating greater and greater social problems. There's a danger of a kind of anesthetizing effect of sometimes these substances, and here, I think literature is a real good resource for this, thinking of like J.G. Ballard's Cocaine Nights, or particularly Huxley's, Brave New They had this discussion of this idea of kind of narco hypnosis. What's the drug? Summer's the drug that they all take in the land of the Brave New World that keeps these people, in a state of kind of pleasant contentment, never able to challenge the society that they're in. Drugs can be used by that in terms of a kind of capitalist tradition, and that's why I think it's important to try and look at them in this more kind of deconstructed level, to try and think about, well, what does drug reform look like? What would a society in which we use psychoactive substances in a way that weren't alienating, that didn't lead to a breakdown in relations, that didn't facilitate addiction as we know that to do now, because I don't think that these things exist inherent within the substances themselves. I think that they are something that manifests in the society that we exist in.
I mean, some of them are just chemically addictive, right? And I suppose in terms of if you think that the state sometimes does that to protect its citizens, then yes, I think the reason someone gets addicted to heroin is never going to be purely the substance itself. Obviously, there was a reason they decided to take it at that point, but potentially having a state which removes heroin from circulation at that point when someone feels a bit vulnerable is a good thing.
But could I just jump in on this point? So, first of all, I'm not a medical expert, but in terms of this idea of them being inherently addictive in terms of the chemical hooks that particular substances facilitate within our brain, the example that you just used is the kind of example par excellence, the idea of heroin. Almost everyone, we all think any use of heroin, we will be addicted, we will end up in the gutter. That is going to happen. But if people go for major medical substances, you might be on morphine, pure morphine, for months at an end. And then when you conclude your particular medical procedure, you transition off that substance, and we know how to do that. You ensure that the transition happens in a kind of healthy, coherent environment. If you've been sick and then you're coming out of hospital, you're going to be surrounded by your loved ones. You're going to be, supported. You're going to be rewarded, and that's the kind of social engagement that can allow people to safely transition from something that's supposedly inherently addictive. So it's not simply just the substance. It is also the context in which you take it and the context in which you don't take it, which facilitates addiction, I think.
I mean, not to kind of go post-structuralist again, but herein lies...
You're allowed to go post-structuralist.
Yeah, I mean, but like, I think it's good also to kind of bring it down to the kind of a materialist understanding of the way in which drugs operate. But there are kind of slippery illusions when we refer to drugs and what drugs refer to. And so I think one of the ways that we sometimes subdivide what drugs refer to maybe as medicines or as illicit psychoactive substances. But even within those two categories, and they seem like fairly stable categories. So medicines are kind of good drugs that help us and that make us better. But illicit psychoactive substances are the ones that, you know, will make us addicts, hedonists, and are attached with all of the social problems that people assume, whether rightly or wrongly, that are attached to them. But the problem is, obviously, there are chemicals which blur the distinctions between medicines and psychoactive substances. And, you know, for example, you know, codeine and cocodamol, they're part of, you know, the larger family, a taxonomy of opiates. And yet, I can go down to Boots and buy that now.
Can you buy cocodamol? I thought that's prescription now.
I think you can get cocodamol of a particular strength. I think it's over codeine. Yes, yeah. But you know, fundamentally it has the opiate in it. And therefore when we think about decriminalisation, I think it's absolutely imperative. What Kojo is talking about is that this has to take place within a wider scale of social reform and looking at why people take particular drugs and why they become addicted to them. So saying that, you know, heroin is inherently bad doesn't account for the fact that we take attenuated forms of heroin to medicate ourselves, and there are ways that we can get off that, which are absolutely fine. So we can never think about solutions to this without kind of looking at the post-structuralist element. What are the kind of slippery illusions between what we would class as a medicine and a illicit psychoactive substance, and B, looking at the kind of wider material context as to why people take these drugs and why they become addicted to them.
Is there a danger? So in terms of being very sort of practical, what the left should be demanding at this point. So I can see the argument as to why, if we legalised it, but whilst restraining the ability of corporations to advertise and to have huge, incredibly lucrative monopolies on the heroin industry, etc., etc. Or if we had a fabulous welfare state that meant everyone felt so self-assured and like they had the support networks required to not let them get addicted to heroin, etc., etc. And you know, if we made a really brilliant society, then I think we could manage legalization. Yeah. And if we had a society where, you know, corporations were really under democratic control, I think we could handle legalization. But if we let that, you know, cat out of the bag at this point, considering where we are, is there not a danger that we just we open up whole new areas of exploitation for capitalists in a way that could be incredibly damaging for ordinary people, just in the same way that tobacco was before it was regulated?
I think that's a really serious question that we have to wrestle with, you know, and I don't want to present the legalization as some silver bullet that by itself will resolve all of the social problems that we try and identify in the book. There's a lot of other social changes that would have to accompany legalization in order for it to really function as we would want. I think that what we would have to really wrestle with is where is the harm that's currently existing. Like, to really think about the devastation that the war on drugs has visited across the world, you know, and I really want to hold on to that idea. I know a lot of people are trying to maybe think about, the idea of the war on drugs as it was used by a plethora of United States presidents following Nixon, Reagan, you know, Clinton, all use this idea of the war on drugs. That's kind of concluded now. No one really uses that anymore. We should move away from that phrase. But I don't think that takes account of the real military operation that has happened in terms of Plan Colombia, you know, a $1 billion funded program of counter-narcotics from the United States in terms of impacting and trying to reduce the cocaine supply from the Colombian region into the United States from the Meridia Initiative, a similar project that was heavily funded by the United States in terms of trying to reduce the transition of drugs from Mexico, counter-narcotics programs that are happening in West Africa, in Jamaica, all around the world. There has been huge devastation as a result of the current system that we have, the system of trying to prohibit these substances that are listed in the 3 international drug treaties. And so that's where I think we're starting from. And I think that that's a system that we can't really allow to continue. Yeah. Not if we want to have solidarity with, a lot of people that we would consider, people we should have affinity and empathy with. So I think that that's the situation that we have now, and then we need to think about the transition that is happening regardless. So, like I said, the Evening Standard have just ran, week-long pro-weed legalization.
Yeah. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. I mean, they've run a few campaigns that didn't happen. But
that's
I suppose,
true.
But I take your point about starting from the perspective of, because then we can talk about the effects of the war on drugs in Britain or the United States, but I think where it's had the most human devastation is in the global south, and especially in Mexico and Colombia, which you've written about. So if you're coming from the perspective of how do we, or let's isolate where the most harm is happening, and that is happening in Colombia or Mexico and Latin America or Afghanistan. From that perspective, what is the angle of reform that most immediately addresses that catastrophe? Is it legalization?
So I think that the reform of the 3 international drug prohibition treaties, this is something that has been called for. So first of all, listen to what's being called for by often, sometimes not even very radical Latin American governments. So we've had presidents of, Colombia as a leftist president, you know what I mean? But we've had presidents call for drug policy reform from Colombia. We've had the implementation, like I said, of marijuana reform already with the Mujica government in Uruguay. We've had Morales getting Bolivia withdrawn from the International Convention in order to be able to get a special dispensation regarding coca leaf chewing. He actually went to the United Nations and actually chewed coca leaf on stage and dared Antonio Maria Costa to try and arrest him for transitioning these international laws. And so I think that the reform of those particular treaties is a starting point, and then thinking about the way in which what look like they're going to be very valuable legal commodities in the capitalist global marketplace in the 21st century, these particular substances, how we're able to ensure the control of these commodities and the profit and benefit of these commodities is being felt by the communities that produce them. Because, what is really interesting about the kind of 20th century history of drug policy is that, firstly, it's very rare for kind of the trajectory of capitalism to relegate an incredibly profitable commodity from the legal marketplace. In the 18th, 19th century, like I say, opium, cocaine, incredibly profitable for the European empires. The 20th century, this is now rendered no longer part of the legal marketplace. So that's immediately interesting. And then secondly, you wonder why that has happened, because it's not like, in the kind of neo-colonial world that commodities have to be illegal for exploitation and devastation to be visited on communities in the global south. Look at the history of gold, look at the history of, oil, the list can go on and on. And so we want to make sure that the transition of these substances into legal commodities doesn't simply become another potential resource for exploitation.
I'm going to start taking audience questions, so put your questions in the comment section whilst you are typing those. I'm going to tell you one more time, actually, why not? Novara Media, Tiski Sour is only possible because of your kind donations. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. You're what makes this show possible. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com. As you know, our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Please share this video on Twitter, on Facebook. Like it. It means it appears in more people's news feeds. So keep those questions coming. Let's look, while that's happening, let's look at the terrain in Britain. Who is at the vanguard of the push for drug reform? So at the moment, if I'm correct, it seems like the left are being kind of quiet. Mm-hmm. The Adam Smith Institute and the Evening Standard are really at the forefront of this progressive cause. Is that correct?
I mean, don't know what that says about the United Kingdom. It's just, incredibly disappointing. But there has been huge amounts of work that has been done in drug policy reform by tireless progressive organizations. Release, an organization that's very close to my heart, has led the kind of drive for drug policy reform in the United Kingdom, since it was established in 1967. Transform is another fantastic organization. You've got Harm Reduction International. So there is a lot of progressive organizations that have a place. But in terms of the kind of national conversation, it does appear that over the last year or so, there has been a lot of ground that's been taken by the kind of liberal free market kind of capitalist outlets like the Adam Smith Institute, like the Evening Standard. And like I was saying, this isn't something that's new for the capitalist class, and for particularly for kind of liberal free market ideology. Milton Friedman was famously very much in favor of drug policy reform. William Buckley, that famous radical, was very much in favor of drug policy reform. John Stuart Mill, the kind of doyen of English liberalism, in On Liberty, has a huge section where he writes about how the prohibition of opium by the Qing dynasty in China, the prohibition of opium, is evil. So, in the middle of the 19th century, the prohibition, the attempt to prohibit drugs was considered evil. Fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, when you actually have the first kind of major United Nations treaty prohibiting drugs, the Convention on Narcotic Drugs, 1961, you have in the preamble one of the very few examples of anything that's being prohibited being described as evil. That happens in the preamble of the 1961 Convention. Other international laws that aren't described as evil include genocide, apartheid, slavery in terms of their international treaties, but drugs are described as evil. And so you see that transition from the 19th century, when to prohibit drugs was considered evil, to the 20th century where the actual trade of drugs is considered evil. And what I think we're happening now, at least in the United Kingdom with the Adam Smith Institute and with the Evening Standard, is just a return to that 19th century Victorian liberal free market position. I think it's something that needs to be challenged by progressives.
I think wasn't there a kind of a royal commission in the late 1800s into opium, which kind of largely concluded it was a positive thing. So I just think that we're kind of seeing the reemergence of that, and I think it's important. I mean, what one can anticipate these shifts in the kind of the profit logics and the marketability and the commodification of these, and the ways in which these can be exploited to kind of create surplus value, and I think that's the shift away from moralism towards kind of that we saw with the kind of temperance movements in the early 1900s towards a kind of commodification, which presages this kind of decriminalisation. But that's just one of a multitude of ways in which we can realise and imagine reforms, and one which we should kind of steer clear of, I think.
I mean, Rory Stewart might end up being a groundbreaker in terms of the comeback of opium tea.
Right.
But I think that's where it's all about, where are your political allegiances and where are your political concerns. If the motivation for drug policy reform is we're spending so much on prohibition, it's not working, think how much money we could save, think how much tax we could accrue from the trade, think about all the cannabis entrepreneurs that could be launched, the green rush it's being described as, in a City AM article I think recently. If that's your motivation, like Tanzil was saying, the opening up of new potential spaces of profit accumulation for capital, you're going to have one type of reform. If your concern and where you feel your commitment lies to in terms of the impact of over-policing on particular communities, the impact of over-surveillance, the impact on terms of the material consequences of prohibition for communities in the global south and those kind of international trade lines, you're going to have a very different type of drug policy reform, and I think that's the kind of starting point we want to hold on to.
But you are going to need an unholy alliance between you guys and ASI and the Evening Standard to push through what is quite a controversial reform, right? You need a coalition. So I mean, there's presumably going to be some sort of compromise when drugs. Well, if you're saying that the move towards decriminalisation is inevitable, there is going to be some compromise between you guys and the Liberals.
I mean, well, first of all, I'm a very bad politician, so in terms of actually organising compromise, I might not be the best one to speak to. But also, I think that whilst there may be a certain level of shared interest, there's also going to be real antagonisms in terms of, what happens in a society that has become dependent upon a particular, demographic, a particular percentage of that population being over-policed. If you have one of the main mechanisms that facilitates people's entry into the criminal justice system through stop and search, through, arrests, if you have that removed, what happens to that? What happens in terms of what's going to happen with the profits that are accrued from this new open, exciting marketplace for capitalism? Are those profits going to be invested in impoverished communities of color? Are they going to be invested in healthcare and support for people who might suffer from problematic substance use and addiction? Or are they going to be siphoned off in offshore accounts and in hedge funds? Those are going to be real issues of antagonism. So I think the idea that, there's just going to be an easy holding of hands between political radicals who are committed to things like prison abolition and, criminal justice reform, and those who are committed to a kind of, libertarian, new version of the dot-com bubble, but with weed, or maybe more weed. There's a lot of weed in that bubble as well. I don't think that alliance is going to be
What
as
weed
easy.
from what, by the coders? By the Google people?
Yeah,
or
just by the general...
by the California
Valley,
scene.
Silicon Valley, yeah.
Are there any known downsides to the Portugal model from an anti-capitalist, anti-racist perspective? Is there anything constructive we can learn? That's from Joseph O.
Are there any known downsides? I mean, there's downsides with every system, and I think we touched upon a few of them when we talked about the limitations of decriminalisation within one particular country. And there's.
So most of the downsides would have been in other countries, external to Portugal.
And also, the fact that, like I said, you are decriminalising possession of all drugs. You're not decriminalising supply of those drugs. So even within Portugal, in terms of, who's supplying these particular substances, there's still that question that has to be addressed in terms of, as Tanzil pointed out to, the wider societal change around how do we see these drugs, how do we see these substances. That's not an automatic consequence of decriminalisation. You can be saying that it's still a bad thing, but it's not as bad as we thought it was. It's not worth having these huge counter narcotics enforcement policies. So there are still limitations of it, but it's definitely an improvement on the system that we have in the UK and have had since the middle of the 20th century.
I'm going to ask it's a random question that I don't think it's really related to what we've said, but I'm going to ask it because I know that as both experts of empire, you're going to know the answer.
Are we?
So Wave the Rules asks, why did we end up with Hong Kong for 99 years?
What?
So I think I'm having a educated guess at this.
Yeah.
So I think Hong Kong was given to the British in the Treaty of Nanjing following the First Opium War.
Yeah.
So the First Opium War, as Kojo mentioned, was where initially the East India Company and then overtaken directly by the British government were exporting opium into China, then kind of presaged by gunboat diplomacy, heralded the First Opium War. And then
tried to prohibit that trade in order to maintain.
So it was drug related. I was wondering if it was drug related.
It was drug related. So forgive me if I've mispronounced, but I think it was the Nanjing Treaty. Part of that, oddly enough, part of that treaty was to compensate the British, and then part of that was the transferal of colonial possessions to the British. One of which I think I understand was Hong Kong.
Nice one. I knew one of you would have it. Anyway, it's been an hour, so let's call it a day. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you
I've
very
learnt
much
a
for
lot.
having us.
Cheers for having us,
I'm going to go have a little legal beer now, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not very drunk. I'm a bit lame, I suppose. Anyway, everyone's asking their drugs of choice, but I don't know whether to put that to you because I know you both work in education, so it might be a risky question. In any case, I'll let you avoid that.
Yeah.
You've been watching Tiski Sour. This was Navarro Media. If you are a subscriber, thank you
I'm a good Christian boy.
very much.
People are talking about here.
You are what makes this possible. If not, You know our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Please go to support.environmedia.com. Like this video, share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter. We'll see you at the same time, same place next week. Good night.